So I'd like to start off by thanking everyone for attending this, our virtual session at the Charleston Conference 2023. Today we have a great panel of people to talk about public access to federally funded research and what that will bring in the future. We'll be joined by voices from funders, from institutions and researchers. And so to that end, I'd like to just very quickly introduce our speakers. We have Jessica Tucker from the National Institutes of Health. We have Miranda Bennett from California Digital Libraries and Sarbajit Banerjee from Texas A&M, who will be talking with us today. But before we get into the panel, I thought it would be worthwhile just to set the scene a little. And so to start off with, just in terms of the American Chemical Society, just to reiterate our commitment to public and open access. And this can be demonstrated through the rapid increase in the uptake of open access that we've seen in recent years through our community, and the work that we've done to support that through launching fully open access journals, converting our hybrid journals to transformative journal status. For those of you unfamiliar with Coalition S, that is a requirement for funding of APCs and is a pathway towards transitioning hybrid journals to being fully open access. And that includes an open access option in all of our hybrid journals. We continue to invest heavily into open access, and we continue to actively work with our partners around the world in consortia and universities to agree transformative arrangements in order to move the output ever more towards openness. But in terms of the world now and why we're here today, many of you will be aware of the fact that just over a year ago, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy issued the so-called Nelson Memo, and this overwrote the previous Holdren Memo on public access. There were some fairly significant changes in that, not least the fact that this now applies not only to research outputs in terms of journal articles, but also to the data that underpins those. Also, it applies to all federal funding agencies, not just those with an expenditure or annual budget of over $100 million. And finally, it removes the historical 12-month embargo period that publishers previously were able to apply to their research papers that they'd published. It's not quite open access, despite that. Certainly, if you use the Budapest Open Access Initiative definition of open access, because this doesn't require liberal licensing in the vein of Creative Commons license, technically not open access, but certainly as close as you can get without it being open access. There are some known unknowns, to quote a former White House staffer. And so we don't know yet what the funding landscape will look like in 2026 when the Nelson Memo comes into effect. And we don't know exactly how certain key infrastructural challenges will be solved, especially looking around research data and infrastructure associated with some of the smaller federal funding agencies. So, for example, the National Endowments for the Arts or Humanities. We don't understand entirely how this will interface with established publishing preferences from authors, or indeed how this will interface with other large transnational open access approaches and mandates, such as those put forward by Coalition S. And finally, as is often the case with changes in mandates, at the moment there is certainly a strong suspicion, I would say, that there is relatively low awareness of the changes that are coming down the track beginning in 2026, amongst researchers themselves. Obviously, that will be a very mixed picture depending on how interested individuals are in open access and other scholarly communications issues. But I think it would be fair to say that historically, awareness of mandate changes has grown at the last minute rather than significantly in advance of changes being made. So with that background, I'll first hand over to Jessica Tucker, who joins us from the National Institute of Health. She is Acting Deputy Director of the Office of Science Policy and will give us an insight from the perspective of a research funder that is having to put in place this policy guidance. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you here today. Of course, NIH and the U.S. government has long been committed to enhancing access to the results of federally funded research, and I'm really excited to provide a brief overview for you here today regarding sort of what exists now and sort of what some of the plans are for the future. So, as Chris, you mentioned in your introduction, last year in August of 2022, the OSTP memo on ensuring free, immediate, and equitable access to federally funded research was released. You already highlighted some key points, but just to reiterate, sort of from our perspective in terms of the topics and the categories of things that were addressed by that memo, it really had to do with data, publications, and findability. There are other things embedded there, but that's sort of how we're thinking about it at NIH, and I know some other funders as well. So with regard to data, as noted, one of the expectations is that scientific data underlying publication should be accessible at the time of publication, and that agencies should put in place approaches for sharing all scientific data, or should consider putting in place approaches for sharing all scientific data. With regard to publications, the expectation is that federally funded publications should be freely available and publicly accessible without the currently allowable embargo period, again, as you noted, Chris. And then finally, there is a piece that is dedicated to findability and transparency that has to do with putting in place appropriate policies regarding metadata and persistent identifiers. So NIH put into place a plan back in February of this year that we put out for public comment at the same time that we shared it with OSTP and OMB, and it addresses all of these aspects. In some aspects, sort of articulating the things that we're already doing, and in some places talking about what we plan to do more of, or what we plan to do to enhance accessibility to federally funded research. So just briefly, with regard to data sharing, all expectations from the OSTP memo were satisfied by NIH's recent policy on data management and sharing, which was implemented back in January of this year. And essentially that policy does expect investigators to have in place a data management and sharing plan, and also to make data as accessible as possible as part of those plans. So I won't say a lot more about that since our policy is in place, although happy to have further discussion on that topic. But I encourage folks to check out sharing.nih.gov to learn more and see more resources about our policy in that space. For publications, NIH is really building upon our existing public access policy that has been in place since 2008. As part of that policy, we have PubMed Central, which houses millions of NIH-supported articles and other articles as well. But again, right now it is with an allowable one-year embargo period. And as was noted earlier, ultimately when these policies take effect, the idea is that peer-reviewed scholarly articles will be available in PMC as soon as processing within PMC is complete. So essentially the removal of the one-year embargo period. The other aspect of our plan, in short, related to publications is the key importance of continuing to monitor trends in publication fees and policies to ensure that things remain reasonable and equitable. A lot of our plan has to do with ensuring that equity is at the center of all of this. We believe that making these publications available to the public without an embargo period is in itself an act of making things more transparent and equitable. But of course, we don't want to create tension on the other side of the process that could increase inequity in some ways. And so that is sort of one of our really key things that we're focused on in our plan and policy development. So as for persistent identifiers and metadata, this aspect is on a much longer timeline. NIH has been piloting efforts in this area, and there's more to come. So please stay tuned. In the short time that I have left, I just want to also note that NIH has conducted quite a bit of outreach on our plan, and there's more to come. We had a listening session in April earlier this year. This webinar was recorded and is available on our website. And we also, as I mentioned, put our plan out for public comment. We had close to 150 commenters, and those comments are also available for review on our website for those who are interested. I'll just highlight a few key points, which are that many people did agree that the current embargo period limits availability of publications and supports removal, but of course the devil is in the details. And folks noted quite a bit about availability of publications is not the same as accessibility. Of course, NIH already does a lot to make our publications accessible, but we heard some interesting comments that we're considering with regard to accessibility as well. We heard, again, quite a bit about equity in terms of how to limit administrative burden through clear and concise guidance on mechanisms for compliance. And of course, as has been noted, a lot of questions about sort of how the publishing ecosystem will evolve and how cost structures will evolve with that. And again, that also comes with sort of these equity considerations. And many commenters noted that NIH should continue to monitor fees to publish and the impact on these fees for equity to help best define what is a reasonable cost for the purposes of this exercise. So our next steps are that NIH is sponsoring in collaboration with some other HHS agencies, a National Academies workshop on this topic on public access. It's both virtual and in person in DC on November 30th and December 1st. So encourage folks to tune in there. This will further enhance our ability to hear more points of view. Because ultimately our intent is to revise the NIH public access policy, put it out as a draft for comment, and essentially continue the policy development process. But we again anticipate lots of other opportunities for comment on that draft policy as well once that is developed. And we also intend to put out a plan for PIDs and metadata and follow that policy development process moving forward. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Next, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Miranda Bennett from California Digital Libraries, where she is the Director of Shared Collections. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks for the opportunity to offer some thoughts on this important topic. As Chris said, I'm Miranda Bennett. I'm Director of Shared Collections at California Digital Library, and that's part of the 10-campus University of California system. So I'd like to approach this session's topic from the perspective of an interest I believe is shared by all the communities represented on this panel, which is making compliance with public access policies as clear and easy as possible for authors. We often focus on the financial costs of compliance, and this is a real issue. We overlook it at our peril, but there are also real costs in terms of time, effort, and goodwill when any step in meeting the requirements of a public access policy places barriers between authors and compliance. Speaking as a librarian working for a publication-intensive university system that receives billions of dollars in U.S. federal research grants annually, I have a significant interest in supporting the recipients of these grants and making the results of their research widely available. Even before the OSTP Nelson memo was issued in August 2022, University of California authors had spent years becoming increasingly familiar and comfortable with the requirements for open and public access to research, and that they had enjoyed support for OA publishing through mechanisms such as transformative agreements with journal publishers and the UC open access policy. Even so, minimizing the time and effort asked of authors who need or want to publish their work openly remains challenging, and we are already preparing authors for the new compliance requirements that will result from the Nelson memo. It will take collaboration among funders, publishers, and libraries to enable authors to make the publications and data resulting from federal funding publicly available. I want to begin with clarification in 3 key areas. The first is clarity about what constitutes compliance. In the words of the Nelson memo, quote, federal agencies should update or develop new public access plans for ensuring, as appropriate and consistent with applicable law, that all peer-reviewed scholarly publications authored or co-authored by individuals or institutions resulting from federally funded research, at this point, the words become bolded, are made freely available and publicly accessible by default in agency-designated repositories without any embargo or delay after publication. What does this mean with regard to green, that is repository-based, versus gold or journal publication-based open access options? Those of us in libraries want to start preparing to support authors now. So we're trying to raise awareness among authors about the requirements to come, but we're not the official interpreters of the OSTP memo. Authors may hear different messages today about whether, for instance, publishing an OA journal article under one of UC's transformative agreements will be sufficient in and of itself to comply with federal funding agency requirements. The second point is clarity about how federally funded authors can comply with public access requirements while retaining all the rights they're entitled to, especially those established by institutional open access policies and/or government use license. I know this can be a difficult question for publishers, but developments such as ACS's recently implemented article development charge are raising major concerns in the library community and muddying the water for the compliance waters for authors. Authors deserve clarity about their options for compliance, including what, if any, costs are involved and how those costs can be covered. And then the third point is clarity and, ideally, in a perfect world, simplicity about the steps authors should take to achieve compliance. In nearly every venue, when we talk to authors about the OSTP memo, they express concern and often frustration at the prospect of another tax on their time and distraction from the substance of their research. This is where there are real opportunities for funders, publishers, and libraries to work together on workflows and infrastructure, and I include metadata in the category of infrastructure, to streamline and automate processes for depositing publications and data in the appropriate repositories. This is easier said than done, to be sure, and today's session is probably showing you that even the saying isn't all that easy, but we do have to start somewhere. And we at UC, and I believe in many other parts of the library community as well, are ready to start and hope that our funder, publisher, and author colleagues are as well. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion with my fellow panelists and with those of you who are attending the virtual Charleston conference. So back to you, Chris.
And with that, I'll hand over to the last of our panelists for their thoughts. So over to you, Sarbajit Banerjee from Texas A&M.
Thank you, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be here to provide a slightly different perspective. It's been really great hearing from Jessica and Miranda. I wanted to give you a little bit of a perspective from the trenches, both as a researcher as well as an editor of ACS Omega, which, as you know, has a global footprint, and I think has truly been pioneering in bringing open access to the entire global community of scientific researchers. What I did want to do in the spirit of FAIR principles. I wanted to present just a few slides on something we're doing at a Department of Energy Energy Frontiers Research Center that I run along with my colleague Stan Williams, and we are seeking to pilot many of these practices. The center has been funded for just about a year, so we're just getting started. But I think it's a good model for thinking about the entire data to metadata to publication continuum and how we might be able to make that available. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is how our EFRC thinks about this. We're linked across 4 institutions, Texas A&M University, as well as 3 national labs, including Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And we're interested in data warehousing approaches. We've got a data infrastructure committee going, and we're trying to see how we can take this and pilot it so that it does become a model for each of our institutions. And if you go to the next slide, please. So this is our model workflow. Both in terms of physical samples shared by a lot of folks, simulation data, experimental data, and trying to think through deeply how we can arrange this across multiple layers of abstractions using some infrastructure investments such as RFID tags, information codes, and trying to build out a central database. So this is still early days, but this is our goal to really ultimately scale this nationally. And if you go to the next slide, please. Yes. So this is the idea of having code repositories, data repositories, and then having this master database that's interfaced with different platforms. We've started publishing initial sort of complete workflows, which include Mendeleev datasets, GitHub codes. So we're not doing this for every publication. We're not yet there, but we've started to do this for a few publications, and I think we're excited as to what that shows us for usage and getting our researchers familiarized with the processes and addressing and proactively coming up with a little bit of a sober understanding of the actual challenges. And I think, Chris, one of the challenges that I see as a researcher is that in the Nelson memo, and a lot of the legislative mandates getting handed down is, of course, the fact that much of it is unfunded. Unfunded both in terms of resources, unfunded both in terms of time, and oftentimes disconnected from the incentive structures the current incentive structures that exist in academia and industry today, and also very much a one-size-fits-all that doesn't take into account the innovation ecosystem and its interface. And this is challenging at a time where there is a big push in the Biden-Harris administration on large public-private partnerships. So this is I think there's some real ideas we have to wrestle with, real practical challenges we have to wrestle with. Like Miranda said, the tax on students' time, the tax on students and postdocs are, of course, truly in the trenches in every aspect of this. How do you incentivize this for them in a manner that is fair to them, as also to the funders and the rest of the community? If you go to the next slide, this is so this is again some practical ideas we've implemented. Student-driven, how to have data management protocols, traveler sampler protocols, and then if you go to the next slide, that's I believe my final slide. So this is Johnny Manziel from Texas A&M doing the cash sign that he became famous for. It's truly who will build this data infrastructure, even for an effort. Ours is about a $12 million effort, so it's not a gargantuan center, but who is even here we're finding some that we're going to have to build out lots of data infrastructure to make this viable to everything we do. Again, there's a difference between having meaningfully, intentionally, purposefully picking out specific projects and then really implementing this across the board. Quality control, truly making the data the I part of FAIR, right? So that it can be accessed, but also be interoperated. Truth be told, in many instances in the physical sciences where we don't have perhaps the same standards and standardization as in the life sciences, I think some of the initial statistics we're seeing are pretty dismal in terms of how much data actually gets reused and how much data is actually accessed. And then I do want to say, I think there's this massive push across our entire funding ecosystem about what this means for innovation, intellectual property. We have, an incredible opportunity here in this country to inspire students to be entrepreneurs, to inspire students to take their research into technology. But what does this mean? I think this hasn't been fully thought through by many of the folks who have been advocating this stance. And my last comment, wearing my ACS Omega hat, I find it heartbreaking dealing with the emails from authors from the Global South for whom an APC charge is their entire month's salary, sometimes twice the entire month's salary, sometimes manyfold. And I think the entire program for open access that we have seen has often ignored the ground realities of funding ecosystems outside the United States, and this is a real loss. This is because I think as we all understand, as we all can I think get behind the idea that good ideas can come from anywhere, and if these ideas do not get disseminated because researchers have to make a choice between paying for food or publishing their work, I think we are ending up in a much worse situation. So I'm really having done this for a while, I'm having second thoughts about what this means. When I go to Eastern Europe and I go to India, their APC is a real challenge to the scientific development and growth of their ecosystems. And I think that this is something that is again a matter of fairness, but it's also a matter of thinking through what sort of future we're looking at and who will contribute to it from equity perspectives, global equity perspectives. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. And I think that equity question is one that is a whole other session that we could have, and that many publishers and other interested parties have had over recent months and years. Clearly, the APC model is not the panacea that it was once thought that it might be, and that even waivers have significant issues with them in terms of how they're applied, and inevitably the edge cases that will be found with hard and fast cutoffs of that nature. So I'd like to thank all three of our presenters. I think in terms of questions, the first place that I'd like to go actually kind of impacts on a lot of what Subhajit has been doing, which in many ways, although there have been other data mandates around the world, this would be the first really large-scale data sharing mandate. Certainly, it would cover more research than the Data Concordat that has been put in place in Europe. And I'd be interested to hear the thoughts of all of the panelists around what impact that mandate might have. Clearly, data sharing requires potentially very significant infrastructure in terms of simple hardware for a start. So over to you. Who would be interested in having a comment on that? I'm going to nominate. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I can start. Yeah, I think this is in principle, at least in my discipline in material science and materials chemistry, this could be transformative. I think having large data sets available, and there are some good models out there of publicly sourced, crowdsourced, but with additional support, where there we've got crystallographic databases that have existed for a long time. We've got other databases like the Materials Project that was funded by DOE and has become a valuable resource. But I think this all then comes down to who's paying for it. This very substantial infrastructure requirements, very substantial standardization requirements across, even individual laboratories within the same institution, across different institutions. Again, I'm excited by some of what I see. NIST has data repositories which have been working closely. NREL has implemented a large-scale platform. But I think we've got a long way to go. And I think the other thing that we want to also not ignore again is this idea of how do we incentivize it so that's not just a stick. How do we ensure that it doesn't hurt our competitiveness, economic competitiveness especially, and how do we make sure that the demands on funding, I have to say, we're in California, of course, we're just coming out of these unprecedented graduate student strikes. So where do we invest our resources? Resources are limited. Funds haven't gone up very much. Where do we invest these, and how do we pay for all of these?
And Jessica, I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, I think that's one of the things that was really exciting about the OSTP memo is that it doesn't take just one sort of piece of this in publications, right? It's thinking about, making data, more transparent, making it more findable through the PIDs and metadata aspects, and making the publications more accessible. So we were really excited about sort of the integration of all of those aspects. And yeah, I mean, I think that sharing of data can be hugely transformative, and I think that we are in the early stages of thinking about doing these things a little bit in a more sort of regimented and sort of organized fashion. But we at NIH are really excited about it. Certainly we, in some of our data management and sharing policy and related guidance documents, we talk about existing repositories and things like that. But we also, will support, infrastructure costs, associated with data sharing and management. So we're extremely excited about it, and looking forward to what happens next, and agree with Sabarjeet that always that there's never a perfect solution, and we're going to have to keep refining it, but I think this is moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think from a personal perspective, as a very, very lapsed biologist, the work that NIH has done in terms of GenBank as a data repository for gene sequence data over the last few years with COVID, that has clearly become an invaluable resource for researchers around the world. And so I think that we can all agree that data being hidden away and siloed in the back of a drawer on a thumb drive perhaps isn't an ideal output for research that potentially has world-changing application. So moving on from that data question, I think that one of the things that was touched upon by you, Miranda, was the issue of potential for another approach on top of another approach on top of another approach, causing confusion for authors. This is something that in Europe we've seen with Chris Banks, the librarian from Imperial College in London, talking about a policy stack where there are multiple different potential routes to open and different requirements from different funders that may or may not complement one another. So as a representative of a very OA progressive, for want of a better term, institution, how do you see the public access mandate playing along with existing open access mandates, and do you think that this will add further confusion towards an already muddy landscape?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That teed up that question quite nicely for me. Yeah, and I think that the multiplication of requirements for compliance, and of course these are publication compliance concerns, and researchers have to comply with all sorts of other guidelines and rules and expectations as well. So one thing that we're very interested in doing, and this is just speaking for CDL and University of California, is really working collaboratively with publishers and funders. As I said, we're right now we're in this space of transition where we want to prepare authors for what's to come. Chris, I think you mentioned in your introductory remarks that it's like that when it's implemented is when people start paying attention, and there's certainly some truth to that. But we are already talking when we have opportunities with faculty, graduate students, other audiences about what's to come. But we don't want to provide misleading information when we haven't, what we have right now is the OSTP memo, and that's getting interpreted through things like the NIH plan that Jessica referred to. So as these things develop and as we get a clearer picture of what those expectations will be, when we are in negotiation and discussions with publishers, we are starting to talk about what are their plans for kind of bringing together whatever their publication model is for open access with supporting compliance, particularly with US federal policies. Those are going to affect many, many of our authors. So I think there's some real opportunities there. CDL is well positioned to work on infrastructure projects through things, like we've been leaders in the development of DMP tool and things like that. So that's one thing that we're working on, but it's all, it's sort of this iterative process as these plans are announced and made official, then we have opportunities to say, okay, here's what compliance might look like. How can we work with publishers to help make that happen? And then I was really glad to hear Jessica talk about the section of the memo that I hear referenced less often about persistent identifiers and metadata. And I do think that's very key, and also something that CDL is very involved with, because by working with publishers to ensure that that kind of metadata is built in from the start as authors are writing their articles and packaging up their data, that will, I hope, help enable some automation within this infrastructure to provide less of a burden, whether it's on, obviously we're very concerned about authors and researchers, and I really appreciate, Sarbajit, you're highlighting grad students and postdocs as well, but they're also library workers. There are also staff within research offices. It's a lot of time from a lot of different people, and we want to make sure that people are spending their time in the best possible way. So that's some of the ways that we're thinking about this.
And again, I see you've raised your hand, Jessica.
I just wanted to quickly add to something that I didn't have a chance to address in my comments, is that I just want to make sure people are also aware that the U.S. government is also coordinating sort of across agencies on this as well, so that, to try to avoid as much as possible sort of this agency interpreted the memo this way and this agency interpreted the memo this way. There is the National Science and Technology Council Subcommittee on Open Science, which is coordinating this across federal agencies, and also just want to, and obviously there may be some differences from agency to agency depending on the needs of that agency, but to have as much sort of consistency as possible, and also in having discussions internationally as well, within the U.S. government with other countries that are grappling with this. So I just wanted to note that as well.
And that's, really great to hear, because fragmented policy landscapes are good for no one, frankly, and they make everyone's life more difficult. And with that, I think we've come almost to the end of our time. So I'll just finish off by flagging a couple of open science resources from ACS. So we have our website, ACS Open Science, which will provide details on policies and options available to authors from ACS, and also, seeing as we are talking about the policy landscape, the ACS Journal Finder, which will offer advice on what particular routes may be suitable for meeting a particular funder's requirement. I will go on to say it's always use tools of those natures as a first pass, potentially. Always make sure that you check the actual terms within your grant agreement to make sure that the data that we are providing is up to date. Obviously, these things are in a state of flux, hence the point of this particular panel this afternoon. And finally, should anyone have any questions, we will be available for those at the virtual conference. If not, please feel free to pass any questions along to me. I've included my email address on the slide here, and thank you all very much for your time. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to the audience. So thank you.